For as long as she could remember, Claire Saunders had been invisible. At 25, she lived a quiet, unremarkable life as a live-in housekeeper for the Summers family, a wealthy couple who treated her presence as if she were part of the furniture. Her days were filled with dusting, vacuuming, scrubbing marble countertops, and polishing silverware until it gleamed like a mirror. If she ever thought about the future, it was only to wonder if she'd be lucky enough to move out of her attic room and into a tiny apartment of her own someday. Claire didn't dream big. She'd learned long ago that dreams had a way of leading to disappointment. Raised in a foster system that had offered her little love and less stability, she had become resigned to a life of hard work and modest expectations. But that all changed on an ordinary Tuesday morning. It arrived with the usual stack of bills and catalogs the Summers rarely bothered to open. Claire found it while sorting the mail on the kitchen counter, her hands moving automatically as she separated invitations to charity galas from water utility statements. Among the glossy envelopes, a plain white one stood out. It was addressed to her. Claire blinked, unsure what to make of it. The handwriting was neat, almost old-fashioned, and her name, Miss Claire Saunders, was written in a way that made her feel oddly important. She had never received personal mail in her life. With trembling hands, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the letterhead of a law firm she had never heard of. The message was brief. Dear Miss Saunders, it is with great urgency that we request your presence at the offices of Pennington and Locke LLP regarding the estate of your grandmother, Evelyn Carter. Please contact us immediately to arrange a meeting. Regards, Howard Locke-esque. Claire reread the letter 3 times. Her grandmother, Evelyn Carter? She had no idea who that was. I don't have a grandmother, she muttered to herself. 2 days later, Claire found herself sitting in a sleek conference room on the 20th floor of a high-rise building downtown. The receptionist had greeted her with an unnervingly warm smile, and now she waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the door finally opened, a man in a tailored suit entered, holding a folder that looked thick enough to contain her entire life story. Miss Saunders, he said, extending a hand. I'm Howard Locke. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Claire nodded, too nervous to speak. I'll get straight to the point, Locke continued, sitting across from her. Your grandmother, Evelyn Carter, passed away last month. In her will, she named you as her sole beneficiary. Claire's mind reeled. There must be some mistake. I don't even know who Evelyn Carter is. Locke's expression softened. That's not surprising. From what I understand, your grandmother was estranged from your parents long before you were born. However, she kept track of you. She left very specific instructions to ensure you received what was rightfully yours. And what exactly is that? Claire asked hesitantly. Locke slid the folder across the table. Everything, the entirety of her estate, including her personal fortune. The contents of the folder revealed a story that seemed too outlandish to be true. Evelyn Carter had been a self-made billionaire, building her fortune in real estate and international investments. According to Locke, she had lived in relative seclusion for the last 20 years, avoiding the public eye while quietly expanding her wealth. She was a remarkable woman, Locke said, his voice tinged with admiration. Brilliant, resourceful, and incredibly private. She wanted her legacy to go to someone she believed would appreciate it. Claire shook her head, overwhelmed. But why me? She didn't even know me. Locke's gaze was steady. She knew enough. Evelyn believed in you, Miss Saunders. She saw potential in you that others overlooked. The inheritance wasn't just money. It included several properties, a private jet, and controlling shares in multiple lucrative companies. But there was one condition. Claire had to move into her grandmother's estate immediately and take over the management of her affairs. It's not just about wealth, Locke explained. It's about responsibility. Your grandmother believed you were capable of continuing her work. Claire left the law office in a daze, clutching the folder like a lifeline. The thought of leaving her quiet, predictable life was terrifying, but the idea of staying the same, dusting someone else's mansion while her sat waiting, was unbearable. By the end of the week, she was on a plane to her grandmother's sprawling estate, a place she had only seen in photographs. As the jet descended, she caught her first glimpse of the property, a vast, glittering mansion surrounded by acres of manicured gardens. But as she stepped through the grand double doors, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Claire Saunders felt like an imposter as she stepped into her grandmother's grand estate for the first time. The mansion was breathtaking. Ornate chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, marble floors gleamed beneath her hesitant footsteps, and the walls were adorned with artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum. It was hard to believe that all of this was now hers. As she wandered through the house, marveling at its beauty, she suddenly felt the weight of someone's gaze. Turning sharply, she spotted a man standing at the end of the hallway. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her with an unreadable expression. You must be Miss Saunders, he said, his voice calm but commanding. I'm Edward Hayes, the estate manager. Your grandmother entrusted me with overseeing the property, and now with assisting you. Claire nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Edward seemed professional enough, but there was something about his demeanor that made her uneasy. Thank you, she replied. I'll need all the help I can get. Edward gave her a curt nod. Your grandmother was a very private woman, Miss Saunders. There's much about this estate and her legacy that you'll need to learn, but be prepared. Not all of it will be easy to accept. Later that evening, as Claire explored the mansion on her own, she came across a locked door in the library. It stood out because it was the only door in the house she hadn't been able to open. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she began searching for the key. It took hours, but she finally found it hidden in a small wooden box inside her grandmother's study. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, with shelves filled not with books but with documents, ledgers, and photographs. A large desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with papers. As Claire approached, she noticed a single file lying open. Her breath caught as she read the words on the top of the page, "Offshore accounts confidential." Over the next few days, Claire immersed herself in the documents she had found. To her shock, she discovered that her grandmother's fortune hadn't been built entirely on real estate and investments. Evelyn Carter had also been involved in risky, and often morally ambiguous, dealings. From shell companies to offshore accounts, it was clear that she had played the financial game with ruthless precision. But it wasn't just the nature of her business that troubled Claire, it was the names. Among the list of associates and partners were powerful figures from politics, business, and even organized crime. One name stood out, Victor Klein. The files indicated that Victor had been Evelyn's most trusted ally and possibly her greatest rival. There were hints of a falling out, but the details were vague. All Claire knew was that Victor Klein was still very much alive, and he controlled a significant part of her grandmother's empire. One evening, as Claire sat in the study poring over more documents, Edward appeared in the doorway. His expression was unusually grim. You've been digging into your grandmother's past, he said. Claire hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I need to understand where all of this came from. It's my responsibility now. Edward sighed. Be careful, Miss Saunders. There are people who would do anything to get their hands on what your grandmother built. Victor Klein is one of them. If he finds out you're investigating— What? Claire interrupted, her voice rising. What will he do? Edward's gaze was steady. Let's just say that Evelyn Carter didn't make it to the top without making enemies, and now those enemies might see you as an easy target. The next morning, Claire woke to find a letter slipped under her bedroom door. It was written in bold, black letters, "Stay out of things you don't understand. You don't belong here." Her hands shook as she read it. Who had left it? Was it Victor Klein, or someone else who had a stake in her grandmother's empire? Claire realized that she was in over her head. But instead of running, she felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She had spent her whole life being invisible, overlooked, and underestimated. Now, for the first time, she had power, and she wasn't about to let fear take it away. Claire knew she couldn't face this alone. She needed allies, people she could trust. She turned to Edward, who reluctantly agreed to help her dig deeper into her grandmother's dealings. Together, they uncovered more secrets about Evelyn Carter's empire, including a list of key assets that Victor Klein was likely targeting. Among them was a small, nondescript building in downtown Manhattan. According to the files, it housed a vault containing something Evelyn had referred to as her final insurance policy. What's in the vault? Claire asked. Edward shook his head. I don't know. But if your grandmother thought it was important enough to call it insurance, then it must be valuable and dangerous. Claire made a decision. She would go to the building and retrieve whatever was in the vault. It was a risky move, but she couldn't afford to wait for Victor Klein to make the first strike. As Claire prepared for her mission, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The mansion, once a place of awe and wonder, now felt like a gilded cage. She was no longer just a housekeeper trying to get by. She was an heiress, the sole guardian of a legacy that had brought her unimaginable wealth and unimaginable danger. Claire Saunders could feel her heart racing as she approached the small, nondescript building in downtown Manhattan. The address matched what she had found in her grandmother's files, but the place looked so ordinary that it was hard to believe it held anything of value. The street was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as Claire stepped up to the front door. Edward had arranged for a key to be delivered to her, and now it felt cold and heavy in her hand. She hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't being followed before slipping the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior that smelled faintly of dust and metal. The building was nearly empty, save for a reinforced door at the far end of the room. It looked out of place, modern, high-tech, and intimidating. A keypad and biometric scanner were mounted on the wall beside it. Claire pulled out the folder of documents she had brought with her. Among them was a code and an old fingerprint card that Locke had helped her retrieve from the estate's archives. She entered the code with shaking fingers, then pressed the fingerprint card against the scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft beep, the door slid open. Inside was a vault, its shelves lined with boxes and binders. But at the center was a single black case, smaller than the others and secured with a combination lock. Claire opened it carefully, revealing a thick stack of documents and a flash drive. She couldn't resist the urge to skim the first few pages of the papers. Her stomach dropped as she read the contents. It wasn't just a financial ledger. It was a record of deals, bribes, and blackmail involving some of the most powerful people in the world. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note in her grandmother's elegant script. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Use this wisely, Claire. It's your greatest weapon and your greatest burden." As Claire left the building, clutching the black case tightly, she noticed a dark SUV idling at the end of the block. Her pulse quickened. She tried to remain calm as she walked down the street, but the sound of a car door slamming behind her made her break into a run. "Miss Saunders." A deep voice called out. Claire didn't stop. She darted into an alley, her breath coming in gasps as she searched for an escape route. The alley ended in a brick wall and her heart sank. "Running won't help," the voice said again, closer now. Claire turned to face her pursuer. It was a man in a dark suit, his expression cold and unreadable. "Victor Klein sends his regards," he said, stepping closer. Before Claire could respond, a shadow moved behind him. With a swift motion, the man was struck from behind and crumpled to the ground. Standing over him was Edward, holding a heavy flashlight like a weapon. "Are you all right?" Edward asked, his voice tight with concern. Claire nodded, still shaking. "Who was he?" "One of Klein's men," Edward replied grimly. "We need to get you out of here. Now." Back at the estate, Claire and Edward examined the contents of the black case in more detail. The flash drive contained encrypted files, and Edward promised to find someone who could unlock them. Meanwhile, the documents painted an even darker picture of Evelyn Carter's dealings. "What are we supposed to do with this?" Claire asked, overwhelmed. "If this gets out, it could destroy lives, including mine." Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "This is leverage, Claire. Your grandmother didn't survive in this world by playing fair. She knew how to protect herself, and now she's given you the tools to do the same." "But at what cost?" Claire murmured. The next day, a package arrived at the estate. It contained a single item, a photograph of Claire taken from a distance with a red X drawn over her face. "Victor Klein doesn't make empty threats," Edward said, his jaw tight. "He's escalating. He knows you have something valuable, and he won't stop until he gets it." Claire's hands trembled as she held the photo. "Then we need to stop him first." Claire decided to confront Klein directly. With Edward's help, she arranged a meeting under the guise of negotiating a truce. The location was a high-end restaurant downtown, chosen specifically for its public setting. When Klein arrived, he was every bit as imposing as she had imagined. Tall, silver-haired, and radiating an air of quiet menace, he sat across from Claire with a predatory smile. "You've been busy, Miss Saunders," he said, his voice smooth. "I must admit I underestimated you." Claire forced herself to meet his gaze. "Whatever game you're playing, I'm not interested. Leave me and my family's legacy alone." Klein chuckled, his smile widening. "Your grandmother and I had an understanding. She knew how to wield power. I wonder if you've inherited her skill." Claire slid a single page of the documents across the table. "I have this, and more. If anything happens to me, it all goes public." Klein's smile faltered for the briefest moment. "You're bold, I'll give you that, but you're playing with fire, Miss Saunders." The meeting ended without resolution, but Claire felt a small surge of confidence. For the first time, she had stood her ground. Back at the estate, Edward revealed that he had managed to decrypt the flash drive. Its contents were explosive, a comprehensive list of Klein's illegal activities, complete with evidence that could bring him down. "This is it," Edward said. "This is how we end him." Claire's hands tightened into fists. She was no longer the invisible housekeeper, content to fade into the background. She had power now, and she intended to use it. But the game was far from over. The weight of what Claire Saunders was about to do pressed down on her shoulders. She wasn't just playing a game anymore, she was in the heart of it, tangled in the web of the most dangerous people she had ever known. Victor Klein was relentless and his reach was vast, but she had something he wanted, and that gave her leverage. Still, leverage was a fragile thing. Claire's newfound confidence had turned into a burning resolve. After the meeting with Klein, she spent the next few days strategizing with Edward. They knew that going public with the files wouldn't be enough to take Klein down. He had too many allies, too many connections. To truly destroy him, Claire needed to go deeper into his world, into the heart of his empire, and dismantle it from the inside. They decided to play a dangerous game. The first step was to use the evidence they had, secure it, and then start feeding Klein bits of it, making him believe that Claire was willing to work with him, even as she secretly plotted his downfall. Edward set up a meeting with one of Klein's trusted associates, a man named Marco, who had been involved in several of Klein's more covert operations. Marco was a hard man, but he wasn't loyal to Klein, he was loyal to money. And money, Claire had learned, was something she could use to her advantage. The meeting was set in a high-end, discreet hotel suite overlooking the city. It felt almost surreal to Claire, like she had crossed into another world, a world she had no place in. She entered the suite. Marco was already there, sitting behind a polished wooden desk, his expression impassive. "Miss Saunders," he greeted her, his voice cold but with a hint of curiosity. "I wasn't expecting you to be so direct." Claire sat down across from him, holding the stack of documents in her lap. "I'm here because we both know that Klein is dangerous, and I'm sure you're not entirely loyal to him. There's always a better offer, isn't there?" Marco raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I have what you want," Claire continued, her voice steady but with an edge. "Evidence, proof of Klein's illegal dealings. If you help me take him down, I'll make sure you're rewarded. If you don't—" She let the threat hang in the air, her eyes locking with his. Marco leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He seemed to consider her words carefully before speaking. "You think Klein will let you play this game? He'll come for you, Claire. You're not the only one with leverage." Claire nodded. "But I'm the only one with something he can't afford to lose. I'm the one he's afraid of." Marco's eyes flickered for a moment, but he quickly masked his reaction. "You're bold, I'll give you that, but if you're serious, you need to prove it." He handed her a folder and Claire opened it cautiously. Inside were documents detailing the locations of several of Klein's secret holdings, including one very important asset, an off-the-books account that contained a fortune in untraceable assets. "This is your chance," Marco said, his tone now more measured. "I can help you access the account, but only if you're willing to do what's necessary." The plan was risky, but Claire had come this far and she couldn't afford to back down now. Marco arranged for a hacker to access the offshore accounts. They needed to move fast because once Klein realized what they were doing, there would be no turning back. The hacker was a shadowy figure, his face obscured by a hoodie as he worked furiously at his computer in the corner of an empty warehouse. Edward stood beside him, monitoring the progress. Claire paced the room, her mind racing with thoughts of the consequences. "This could be it," Edward murmured. "If we pull this off, Klein's empire will collapse." Claire nodded, though she didn't feel the relief she expected. The closer they got to the end, the more she realized how much was at stake, not just her grandmother's legacy but her own life. The hacker let out a soft curse. "I've breached the system, we're in." Claire's heart skipped a beat as she watched the numbers on the screen change, the money in Klein's account transferring to a new, untraceable one. It was done. But the moment they made the transfer, the air in the warehouse seemed to shift. Claire's phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out to see a text from an unknown number. "You thought you could play the game, but you're just a pawn." Her blood ran cold. "They know," she whispered. "He knows." Edward swore under his breath. "We need to get out of here, now." Before Claire could react, the door to the warehouse crashed open and armed men flooded in, their faces masked. Marco was nowhere to be seen. "Get down," Edward shouted, grabbing Claire and pulling her behind a stack of crates for cover. The sound of gunfire erupted around them, and Claire's heart raced as the realization set in she had been set up. Marco had betrayed them and Klein had anticipated their move. As bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls, Claire's mind worked frantically. She had to escape, but she couldn't leave without the evidence. The flash drive, the account details, it was all too valuable. With Edward covering her, Claire darted for the hacker's laptop, grabbing the drive and stuffing it into her bag. They had only moments before the men would close in. "We have to move, Claire," Edward yelled. "The back exit, now." Claire followed him through the maze of crates, adrenaline surging through her veins. They reached the back door just as the first of Klein's men rounded the corner. Edward shoved her through the door, slamming it behind them. They were in a narrow alley now, the sound of footsteps growing louder. "Run," Edward urged. They ran as fast as they could, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Klein's men were right behind them. They needed a plan, and fast. The game had just become a whole lot deadlier. With the evidence secured, Claire and Edward took refuge in a safe house. They knew it was only a matter of time before Klein's men found them. "What now?" Claire asked, her voice a mix of determination and fear. "We take the fight to him," Edward said, his eyes steely. "This isn't just about money anymore, it's about survival. We use this evidence to bring him down once and for all, and we do it on our terms." Claire nodded. There was no turning back now. Claire Saunders had never imagined that she would find herself in such a dangerous position. The life she had once known, quiet and unassuming, had been irrevocably turned upside down. She had inherited not just wealth, but a legacy of power, secrets, and threats. And now she was at the center of a high-stakes battle for survival. But she wasn't going to run anymore. After escaping the warehouse, Claire and Edward huddled in a safe house, their backs to the wall. The stakes had never been higher. They had the evidence they needed to take down Victor Klein, but they had to be smart. Klein had too many resources, too many loyal followers, and too many ways to make them disappear. They couldn't just leak the evidence. Klein would bury it, erase it from existence before it even saw the light of day. They needed to make a public spectacle. They needed to expose Klein to the world in a way that no one could ignore. After hours of strategizing, Edward made a call to a journalist who had been investigating Klein for years. A man named Daniel Harris, known for his relentless pursuit of the truth, no matter the cost. If we release this evidence to the media, Claire said, her voice steady with resolve, the world will know what Klein has done. His empire will collapse overnight. Edward nodded, but it's a risk. Klein will do everything in his power to silence us before it reaches the public. He's a master of manipulation. I know, Claire replied, but I'm not backing down. As they prepared to leak the evidence, Claire received an unexpected call. It was from Marco. I made a mistake, Marco said, his voice tense. I wasn't planning on this. Klein is furious. He knows you have the documents. You need to leave now or he'll— Before Marco could finish, the line went dead. Claire's heart raced. She knew that Klein would stop at nothing to keep his empire intact, and Marco's sudden change of heart didn't bode well. We need to move fast, Edward said, his voice sharp. Klein's men will be on their way. They quickly gathered their things and left the safe house, heading for the designated meeting point with Daniel Harris. Every moment felt like a ticking time bomb. When they arrived at the meeting location, a small, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city, Claire's instincts were on high alert. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few patrons scattered at tables. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They sat at a corner table, and Edward scanned the room, his gaze sharp. A moment later, a man in a black coat entered the cafe. His eyes locked onto Claire, and she felt a chill run down her spine. It was Victor Klein. Victor Klein wasn't one to waste time. He walked directly to their table, his presence intimidating. I warned you, Claire, Klein said, his voice smooth but laced with malice. You've made a terrible mistake. You're playing a game you don't understand. Claire stood her ground. I understand it perfectly. You've hurt too many people for too long. It's time for you to face the consequences. Klein chuckled darkly. You think exposing me will destroy me? You're just a little girl playing with fire. This is bigger than you, Claire. It always has been. Edward stood up, his hand subtly reaching for the concealed weapon he carried. You're not leaving here in one piece, Klein. Klein's expression darkened. He signaled to the two men standing outside the cafe, and they moved toward the door, blocking any escape. This is it, Claire, Klein said. You're out of moves. But Claire wasn't out of moves. The documents, the flash drive, the recordings, they were all still in her possession. And the journalist, Daniel Harris, was on his way to help them release everything to the public. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Klein, Claire said, her voice steady. You've had control for far too long, but your time is over. Klein smirked. We'll see about that. At that moment, Claire's phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel Harris. It's done. The story's live. The moment the words hit her eyes, chaos erupted. The news broadcasted live, revealing every dark deal, every illegal transaction, every act of blackmail and bribery that Klein had orchestrated. The world now knew the truth. Klein's men were still trying to move in on them, but their attention shifted. The world was watching. As the news spread, Klein's empire began to collapse faster than anyone could have anticipated. His associates turned on him, scrambling to distance themselves from the revelations. Powerful figures in the media and politics were implicated in the scandal, and the public outcry was deafening. Klein's downfall was swift. Within hours, he was arrested, his assets frozen, his reputation shattered. The very empire he had spent years building came crumbling down. But Klein wasn't finished yet. Claire knew it wasn't over. He would be out for revenge. With the world now focused on Klein's crimes, Claire made her final move. She used her newfound position of power to ensure that Klein's assets were redistributed, with much of his wealth going to charity and the victims of his schemes. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about bringing justice to those he had wronged. As for Claire, she no longer felt like the small-time housekeeper she once was. She had inherited not just wealth, but a responsibility. She had taken down a titan, but she also knew that with great power came even greater danger. But she was ready for it. As the dust settled, Claire looked out over the city from the balcony of her grandmother's mansion. The world had changed, and so had she. She wasn't the same girl who had been stuck cleaning houses and dreaming of something more. She was a force now, a woman with the power to change the world, to fight for justice, and to take control of her destiny. And as she stood there looking toward the future, Claire knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning.